honored, and I thank you for inviting me. I will admit that this is a new experience, and in all honesty, I needed to have my children explain to me what Discord was and really how it is used, because this is embarrassing, never heard of it before. But I guess that shows my age and out of touchedness in this highly technological time. In any case, let's begin. وقل ربي أعوذ بك من همزات الشياطين وأعوذ بك ربي أن يحضرون. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي أنزل القرآن الكريم والفرقان الحكيم على النبي الحليم الذي هو على خلق عظيم، وجعله الدليل على خير سبيل، وكتابا فيه تفصيل وبيان وتحصيل، ظاهره أنيق وباطنه عميق، لا تحصى عجائبه ولا تبلى غرائبه. والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على من أرسل حجة للعالمين وكان نبيا وآدم بين الماء والطين، سيدنا ونبينا وشفيعنا حبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا المصطفى الأمجد والرسول المسدد أبي القاسم محمد، وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من يوم عداوتهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في محكم كتابه المبين وهو أصدق الصادقين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فتطمعون أن يؤمنوا لكم وقد كان فريق منهم يسمعون كلام الله ثم يحرفونه من بعد ما عقلوه وهم يعلمون. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. My dear brothers and sisters, first of all, let me begin with a quick disclaimer that I am by no means an expert in the ilm of hadith or in the fiqh of hadith. Just as a student, it is something that you learn, but I, again, am by no means an expert in this topic. And so I will try to share with you whatever I know and whatever little I understand of it, and in the hopes of increasing all of our knowledge, inshallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Holy Quran that there are those people who, in the face of accepting true faith, they, for reasons that we see in society, in humanity as a whole, want to change and distort the meaning of the intended purpose that God has chosen for anything that He has sent as a message through Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And when the Holy Quran uses the term يُحَرِّفُونَهُ مِن بَعْدِ مَا عَقَلُوهُ, it means they take the word or the symbol or the message that has been given to them by Allah's messenger, and they twist its meaning, they change its meaning, they pervert its meaning even after they fully understood and comprehended what the purpose was, what its goal was. And hence the Quran has not only used this phrase for the past community, but certainly for the community of Rasulullah and all humanity. It is human nature, unfortunately, to take information and to twist it despite knowing its true purpose and using it for purposes that are personally driven or fulfill a personal end or a greed or some form of achievement that they want in the life of this world. And yet for Islam, we know that Quran is authentic, it is perfect, it is pure, and it is the guiding principle for us. And Quran points to one other thing, and it says very clearly that وَمَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. That, O you who believe, O humanity in general, that whatever the messenger gives to you, whatever he imparts to you, take it from him, and whatever he prohibits you from, know that this is the will and the commandment of Allah, so stay away from it. And that's why we see that this is a Muslim principle, an Islamic principle that goes beyond sects, that goes beyond which background you come from, that not only is the Quran the guiding principle and the unchanged, immutable teachings of Allah, the code of Allah, but that we must have a human form of that Quran, a living, breathing form that becomes the role model for all of humanity. That is Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam and his holy Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam, for those of us who follow the way of the Ahl al-Bayt, the family of Rasulullah, the holy progeny. And it reminds us that the Holy Quran reminds us that turn to this Prophet. Why? Because the Holy Quran, although it contains everything, it needs to have a human exposition in the form of Rasulullah. And that occurs because we need some model to live by. And hence we come now to the fact that although the Quran has not changed, the Quran is perfect, it is pure, it is immutable through all of these centuries, that we need to go to a source by which we can determine what Rasulullah did and didn't do, and determine how authentic is that. Because clearly with the passage of time, things change. And so for the intents and purposes of this discussion, you all know this, that the hadith is not just what Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam and the Ahl al-Bayt said, but it is also what they did, what they practiced in terms of their actions. And indeed, it is also the taqrir, or the moments in which they were silent and in which there was a silent approval of a certain situation. And because of that, it was accepted to be a hujjah, or a proof upon a certain sort of permissibility or impermissibility. And the Quran almost expressly tells us that we should be careful about how to derive this hadith, how to understand it, and verify where it comes from and what it means. Holy Quran, it says that Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu in ja'akum fasiqun binaba'in fatabayyanu an tusibu qawman bijahalatin fatusbihu ala ma fa'altum nadimin. O you who believe, if a troublemaker comes to you, someone who is fasiq, someone who breaks the laws of God openly and willfully, and comes with some news, comes to tell you something, relay a fact to you, then try to find out the truth of the matter. Try to determine if in fact what he is saying is accurate, it is authentic. Why? Because God forbid you take information that is false, that is devious, and apply it, and because of it some negative consequence occurs. So the Quran is pointing to the fact that don't just take knowledge from any source, but know in fact where you are getting it from. Determine the authenticity of that. So let's look at sort of the development of Shia hadith through the time. And for all intents and purposes, this is going to be quite brief, because the topic of Shia hadith development and its history and its authenticity is very broad. It is very big. It requires years of study and years of discussion. So I will just try to touch on the salient features and keep it to that level of discussion. So we know that Shi'i followers, what I will call Shi'i followers, those people who were devoted to the Ahl al-Bayt at the time of Rasulullah, people like Salman al-Farsi, people like Aba Dhar, people like Bilal ibn Rabah, these individuals knew the importance of writing down what Rasulullah was doing even in his lifetime. They were busy collecting all of the gestures of Rasulullah, the words of Rasulullah, the actions of Rasulullah, and all of it was done under the supervision, or really under the lead or behind the lead of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam. Such that when Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam was writing all of these things down, collating them, it was happening on a regular basis. Now, the prohibition of hadith, unfortunately, started to occur. And this occurred very soon after the demise of Rasulullah. But indeed, it even happened to some degree in the time of Rasulullah. It is related in the book of our brothers and sisters of the Ahl Sunnah, even from them, that there was a man named Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As who came to Rasulullah, or he came and he made a statement that I used to write down whatever I heard from the Messenger of Allah. And I continued to do so until the Quraysh, they came to me, the people of the Quraysh, and they said, how is it that you are writing down anything you hear from this man who you call the Prophet, who you believe to be the Prophet, when he is just a human being who experiences anger and pleasure just like everyone else? And yet when this was brought to the attention of Rasulullah, Rasulullah refuted it immediately. Now in this lies probably one of the basic issues. And that is, how do you see and how do you visualize Rasulullah, such that you determine subsequently how you're going to take the hadith, or what authenticity, what weight, what significance you're going to apply to his hadith. Well, to us, the followers of Ahl al-Bayt, we need only to quote the ayah of the Holy Quran that says, وَمَا يَنْتَقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ, that when the Prophet speaks, when the Prophet acts, it is not based on his whims or based on some personal inclination. No, it is an inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the wahi that is telling Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam what to say. Hence, this sort of attribution that he is a human who will, wal-ayadhu billah, speak out of anger or speak out of pleasure or greed or some other quality that we all succumb to, is false, because we don't accept that. We don't accept the fact that there was a Muhammad who was purely human like us in his personal life and his dealing with people for personal purposes, and one who was divinely appointed by God and a Rasul and a messenger for other circumstances. If that was the case, then our question would be, how would you be able to determine which aspect of Muhammad was speaking? Was it the prophetic aspect, or was it the personal aspect that was speaking out of whim or out of rage or out of pleasure or greed or one of these human qualities? So instead, we know that it is the most appropriate answer from the Holy Quran, that whatever Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam did, it was purely from the inspiration of Allah. And that's why what came authentically from him, established to be authentic, must be taken as a divine code. It cannot be questioned in that sense. Hence, you see, even in the life of Rasulullah, there were these tendencies. Now, when Rasulullah passed and left this world, you know that people began to dispute about the hadith, about what Rasulullah used to do. Situations would arise in Medina as the soldiers of Islam went out to spread Islam and went out to different places. There would be disputes amongst the people that Muhammad did this, and someone would argue that Muhammad did that. And so the first Khalif, he prohibited the writing of any more hadith or the transmission of any more hadith. And again, this is just relaying the history as it was. In fact, it is even narrated by Aisha, the daughter of the first Khalifa, wife of Rasulullah, that my father, the first Khalifa, had a collection of books, many hundreds of books that contained the traditions of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, and he burned them all. And his reasoning behind it was that these hadith were causing disputes between the people. They were causing problems because people would argue about what was being relayed in the hadith. And yet our answer to that is that just because there were hadith that were being argued about does not mean that there were not those that were authentic, and that there were those that by which you establish the very core of religious practice. So for example, the Holy Quran, it says that there are 3 periods in which one should pray: in the Fajr time, after the passing of midday of the sun, and then after the setting of the sun. Yet how do we know that we must pray 2 rak'at of Fajr, 4 of Dhuhr, 4 of Asr, 3 of Maghrib, and 4 of Isha? Indeed, it is from the legacy of Rasulullah. It is from his tradition. It is from his sunnah. So just to say that people are disputing is not a reason to prohibit the hadith. In any case, that prohibition, although it was reconsidered to some degree in the time of the second Khalif, it almost continued. Except they say that some of the hadith that spoke about religious law, about what was permissible, what was impermissible, how to enact certain contracts, these were now, they started to become transmitted in the time of the second Khalif. In the time of the third Khalif, the same sort of tendency occurred, where there was this hesitation, there was this restriction on people sharing the hadith, or that Rasulullah did this, or we heard that Rasulullah did that. And now, as the years and the decades are going by, realize, my dear brothers and sisters, that this era after the demise of Rasulullah is the demise where the companions who had met Rasulullah, who had been next to Rasulullah, who had seen and spoken to Rasulullah, were still present in the world. We are not so far removed from the time of messengership that the companions are not still present. Indeed, men like Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, who lived well into the 60th year after Hijrah and even met Al-Imam al-Baqir alayhi salatu wassalam when he had grown up, were some of the few people who still remained and had met Rasulullah and had known. So we know that this was a time in which the Sahaba still existed. Now, you know that when the Banu Umayyah came into power after the time of the third Khalifa, after the demise of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, particularly Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan continued the prohibition of certain types of hadith. In fact, any hadith that would extol Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam, they were restricted. And he, in fact, was starting to innovate and create more types, different types of narrations that to some degree lessened the value of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Now, we all know historically that he was one of these people who would encourage the khutaba, the speakers on the day of Jumu'ah, to stand up and to curse Imam Ali alayhi salam. But we see, and again, this deviates from the topic, so we don't need to discuss that any further, but we know that hadith had unfortunately already, not 4 or 5 decades since the demise of Rasulullah, started to become distorted, started to lose its value. And in fact, you know that people had even come to Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib. There was a man named Sulaim. He came to Amir al-Mu'mineen. He said, "Oh Ali, I have heard that there are some hadith, some prophetic hadith that have come directly from Rasulullah that are being quoted by men like Salman al-Farsi, Aba Dharr, and Miqdad, the companions who are considered to be the true followers of Ali ibn Abi Talib, followers of Rasulullah." Man, he says, "Oh Ali, I have heard them quoting hadith from Rasulullah about the interpretation of the Quran, its application, and that these hadith that they are transmitting are different from what other people, what the masses are transmitting. And yet when these men come to you, Salman, Abu Dharr, and Miqdad, and others of their kind, come to you, you verify that what they are saying is correct. So how is there this disparity that exists between people like Salman, Miqdad, and Abu Dharr and the other general public who are quoting different narrations that are completely different or that may disagree in their content? How is that possible?" Amir al-Mu'mineen, he answers the man. He says, "If you want to know the answer, listen carefully and listen with the intention to find out what is the truth." Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says, there are 4 types of people who listened to the hadith of Rasulullah or the actions of Rasulullah or saw the actions of Rasulullah personally and then transmitted that information. He said the first category is the hypocrite. He says there were many hypocrites who surrounded Rasulullah, people who claimed to be believers but actually were not. And they would attribute false statements to the Prophet intentionally and did not care whether it was a sin or not, because it was known that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam said very clearly that it is a sin to do so. And these people, they would pass on these false traditions about Rasulullah and either demean the Prophet or seek to undermine the strength or the influence of Islam, or had some other negative motive. And unfortunately, my dear brothers and sisters, if you see even today in some modern collections of hadith, there are some hadith in there that are absolutely deplorable, that make our Prophet look so lowly, not even like an ordinary man, but they make him look so even lowly, almost, God forbid, wretched looking. And we deny these and we don't accept them. Amir al-Mu'mineen, he says the second category are those people who actually heard the Rasul. They went and heard him, and they heard him and they tried to retain what he said, but unfortunately their minds got confused and they fell into doubt. And although they weren't intentionally trying to lie or deceive people, they continued to propagate something that had become jumbled in their minds, that was not clear. And so they were propagating something that was erroneous. And in doing so, not only were they going astray, but unintentionally they were leading other people astray. There are many examples of this. There is one example in which Abu Huraira, you know, the narrator of hadith, many thousands of hadith in fact, he narrates once from Rasulullah saying that there is a quote of Rasulullah that says, if there is any evil, it is in 3 things: a house, the woman, and the horse. Now he makes this quotation, Yet when the word reached Aisha, the wife of Rasulullah, she said that Abu Huraira did not hear properly, that he did not hear it clearly from the Prophet. Instead, what Rasulullah said was that in the people of Jahiliyyah, from the time of ignorance, pre-Islam, that there were three things that constituted evil for the people of Jahiliyyah. Those were the house, the woman, and the horse. Hence, you can see how just hearing the hadith improperly would cause someone to lead astray, because the two different meanings, one quotation by Abu Huraira, the other by Aisha, have two completely different meanings. And by adding the people of Jahiliyyah to the beginning of the hadith, it completely changes the context of the saying. Hence, you can see the types of trouble that was occurring in that time. Number three, Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam, he says there were a group of people who heard the Prophet ordering something. They heard clearly, they heard correctly, they heard properly what Rasul was saying. Unfortunately, they left. And when they left, they did not hear that Prophet had changed the rule. Just like the Quran has nasikh wa mansukh, the abrogating and the abrogated, you know that the hadith also, Rasul would provide advice, or he would make a command or an order, and then by the command of Allah, later on he might change it. So there were some people who would hear the first one, but didn't hear the second one, which had changed the first one or abrogated the first one. Imam Ali then says that the fourth category, the last category, are those people, this special category, who never once attributed something false to Rasulullah, nor did they ever attempt to twist anything that was said. What Rasul said to them, they took it and 100% with complete fidelity gave it to others. They didn't add anything to it. They didn't subtract anything from it. They didn't supersede it by any means. They shared it. He said these were the people who only specifically these people, now he is speaking about himself, that Allah had allowed Rasulullah to open the door and say, only you and Ali sit, O Rasul. You and Ali and everyone else should leave, and give him the knowledge that is needed for him as the wasi of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. So you can see that there were many ways in which the innovations and the changes were going to appear into the hadith immediately since the demise of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And you know that the Shia were the people, the followers of Ahl al-Bayt were the people who resisted prohibition of writing of hadith from the very beginning. In fact, even from the time of the first Khalif and the second Khalif, when hadith was not being written down, was not being transcribed and narrated and propagated, we know that Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam had made a compendium of the words and the actions of Rasulullah. This book, that even there are some traditions that suggest Sayyidah Fatima alayhi salatu wassalam would refer to them, and that had been passed down from one generation of Imam to the next Imam, and that the Imams had kept with them. In fact, it was even Abu Dharr who in the time of the Khalifas had been exiled. Why? Because he would stand and very vociferously, unafraid of the consequences, tell the people of what Rasul used to do, remind the people of the words of Rasulullah, the actions of Rasulullah, and by transmitting those hadith, people felt threatened, particularly the ruling regime. They took him and they exiled him, and they sent him away until he died in Rabadha, where he finally met his maker in that one desolate place. So we know that there were prohibitions, but that the followers of Ahl al-Bayt were those people who said no. Despite the fact that there are these innovations entering in, despite the fact that people are twisting the words, there will always be a group of people who will ensure the authenticity of hadith. That hadith must continue, that a rigorous system must be determined and developed and adhered to through the years. And indeed, you see today, we have that with us. Contemporarily, we are the result of all of those actions of these people. People like Abu Dharr, people like Salman, people like the companions of the Ahl al-Bayt through the years, the companions of the Imams, who kept on transmitting hadith in the proper way and teaching us today how to live by them. So we know that even in the early days, In the times of the first three Imams, our Imam Ali alayhi salam, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, there were men like Sulaym ibn Qais al-Hilali, men who had collected so many hadith from the Imams directly and had made like a book out of them. And although, unfortunately, some distortions had entered into the book of Sulaym, making them unauthentic, many of the scholars know that this was one of the few companions in the early years of the Imamate who was collecting hadith. And knowing that, unfortunately, the Banu Umayyah particularly were going to oppress it. And not only the Banu Umayyah, but the Banu Abbas as well, following them in the 132nd year after Hijrah when Banu Umayyah fell. And it was particularly under Umar ibn Abdul Aziz in the time of the Banu Umayyah when hadith writing started to increase again. So under Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, the writing of hadith continued to now increase and was now becoming more and more in the Muslim Ummah. And so you see that the Shia, what continued sort of hidden behind the scenes, like people like Sulaym ibn Qais al-Hilali who were doing it secretly or quietly, doing it without many people knowing. Now, as hadith is being written, the Shia began to transmit more openly, particularly in the time of Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq alayhim as-salam, when you know that there were so many great companions who had come and studied under these two Imams, particularly Imam al-Sadiq, and were now not only writing down what was being taught to them by their Imams, but also sharing them. And that many of these men who were the companions of our Imam, they were very high quality individuals, trustworthy individuals. There were even people like men, like a man named Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr. Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr was one of the people who was known as Ashab al-Ijma'. Ashab al-Ijma' are a group of men, approximately 18 men, who constituted trustworthy companions of the A'imma al-Athhar, of our Imams, who they knew that what they were transmitting was authentic and correct. Unfortunately, and Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr was one of the followers of Al-Imam al-Kadhim and Al-Imam al-Rida alayhim as-salam, they faced the persecution of the Banu Abbas. And Muhammad ibn Abi Umayr, he was captured, he was tortured, and he was even killed. And it was sort of a blessing that his daughter had taken the books of hadith that he had compiled, and she had hidden them away when he was jailed. Unfortunately, many of them still got destroyed. Now, in those times, we know, in the times of our beloved Imams, all the way through the smaller occultation, the lesser occultation, and the greater occultations of Al-Imam al-Mehdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu al-Sharif, we know that those companions who were close to our Imams, particularly in the times when things became even more restricted under the Banu Abbas, like in the time of Al-Imam al-Jawad, time of Al-Imam al-Hadi, Al-Imam al-Askari, these three Imams of ours didn't live long lives, nor did they have the freedom that maybe Al-Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wa salam had. All of the works that were being done by their companions, the books, the notes, and these were really not books, they were notebooks almost, collections of papers on which the followers of the Shia, the true followers, continue to write down. The Ashab al-Ijma', the trustworthy, consensus-driven companions who were authentic and trusted by our Imams. They wrote things down on the pieces of paper. Imam Sadiq did this. Imam Kadhim did that. Imam Rida acted in this way. Imam al-Jawad was silent in that manner. Wrote all of these things down and collected them, such that when they got collected finally, they made up what are called the 400 books. They are known as Al-Usul al-Arba'amiyya. Al-Usul al-Arba'amiyya are a collection of notes, 400 sets of notes, in which all of these students had collected, all of these followers had collected the various hadith from the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam. And these 400 notebooks, these usul as they are called, were confirmed by Sheikh al-Mufid many decades, many years later. And they then became the sources, these notes that came from the companions during the time of Imam, they became the sources from which we get the compilations of hadith that we have with us today. So things like Al-Kafi, which are written by Sheikh Al-Kulaini, or Man La Yahdarahu Al-Faqih by Sheikh Al-Saduq, and other books as well. Yet we know that, strangely enough, it was so difficult for these men during the times that they were collecting this information. Not only that, you can see indications of that in the hadith. So, for example, let's say you were to open up Usul al Kafi, and in Usul al Kafi, Sheikh al Kulaini will say one or two names of some of the narrators, but then maybe in the middle or somewhere else, he will say a group of our associates, narrated from, let's say, Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Isa, and take just one name, and then for the rest of the narrators, just say a group of our associates. The reason those men's names were not being mentioned is because their lives were in danger due to the persecution of the Banu Abbas, due to the danger from the spies that were constantly lurking. So you see that the names had been almost redacted out of the hadith and instead replaced. And what would end up happening is that many hundreds of years later, when the explainers of the hadith would come, people who would look at the books of hadith and provide explanatory notes on them, they would find out who these groups of associates were whose names had been redacted. So people like Abu Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Qummi, or Ali ibn Musa ibn Ja'far al-Kamandani, or other individuals whose lives were in danger and whose names had been removed or redacted from the hadith to protect them. Even in this time, in these many, many decades in which our imams were present and then left the world, we know that weaknesses entered into Shia hadith, and that there are things that are not correct. There are things that are questionable. And so how does that happen? Especially if imams are there in their time looking over what their true companions are writing. Well, sometimes the transcription of the hadith was not correct. So one example is given where a companion named Hakam comes to Imam Baqir alayhi salam, and in the body of the hadith we see that the word mukriman is used, that such and such a person does such and such an act, a certain act, and he is mukriman. He does it willingly, or he is honored to do it. He does it purposefully. Now that word mukriman, if you change one letter in that word, it can become mukrihan. So if you take the meme out and you make it a ha, it becomes mukrihan. Mukrihan now becomes a completely opposite meaning of mukriman. Mukrihan means that he was forced. He was not happy doing what he was doing. He was not willing to do it, or he was compelled to do it somehow or the other. So one letter change in the transcription of what was being transmitted would change the meaning. In addition to that, we know that one person transmitting to another person, sometimes the fidelity of that transmission is not clear. Just for example, I know children used to play this game. I used to play it as well, where children sit in a circle and one person starts off by telling a secret, once reading a sentence in the ear of one of the person next to them. That person then tells the same secret to the person next to them, and on and on and on until you get to the last person. And then that last person, they openly and aloud tells what he heard or what she heard. And you see that what was said by the first person who initiated the secret is now completely changed because of what was sort of transmitted from one person to another person. Small words, unclear pronouncements, transcriptional errors, all of these enter. And indeed, the Shia books have that as well. In addition to that, I mentioned already that there was political pressure, that the ruling regimes did not want any hadith, any traditions that spoke about Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam, that pointed to their rightful position, or how Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam had indicated them. And so those hadith could not be mentioned. In addition to that, Shiaism and the followers of Shiaism experienced sectarianism within themselves as well. So you know the formation of the Kaysaniya, the form of the Zaydiyya, and even later on the formation of the Ghulat. The Ghulat even in the time of Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. These people who were extremist Shia, who would say things about our Imams that were clearly false, and clearly against the tenets of our belief. Yet, if they were Shia, maybe their words were being taken as correct, and the hadith was being distorted accordingly. And so you can see that these sorts of issues were happening. Another interesting thing that occurred that may have been the source of distortion or innovation or mistakes occurring in the tradition is that our imams and their followers, the true followers of the imams, the ashab al-ijma', often had to act out of taqiyya. They had to act out of dissimulation and not reveal who they truly were. And if that was the case, when a hadith was recorded about them, there could have arisen some confusion that are they acting according to what a Shi'i is supposed to do? Or is this in fact just the translation of the taqiyya that we are seeing? This is a dissimulative sort of behavior that is being transmitted in the hadith. And how do we know now? And so these sorts of things started to enter into sort of the hadith that was being propagated. And we know that all of these men eventually started to collect the hadith, such that, as I mentioned before, in the time of Sheikh al-Kulayni and the development of al-Kafi, we see the hadith being collected and collected all in one place. And so you see the formation of these books. And again, I apologize. It is a very broad topic, as I mentioned, and so I am rushing through it fairly quickly to give you the salient features of what has happened. So you know, the formation of the books, the four great books that we Shia use in terms of finding of our hadith. One is Al-Kafi by Sheikh al-Kulayni. And you know that he lived in Ray, he spent some time in Baghdad, particularly during the minor occultation. With respect to the hadith, the books of hadith, particularly books like Al-Kafi, which are so venerated, although Kulayni is a trusted source personally, we know that the books of Kulayni, the Al-Kafi has traditions in it that are not entirely authentic, that are questionable in terms of their correctness. Yet you see that even amongst the Shia, the followers of the Ahl al-Bayt, there are those people who will take the words of those hadith, let's say from Al-Kafi, and apply them verbatim without questioning their authenticity, without the research. And there are those people like the Usulis, like us, who must go in and see and determine, is this hadith correct? Is it authentic? Are the chain of narrators, the ones who are transmitting this hadith, reliable men, trustworthy men, and can be used as a source of this information that we are applying to the application of our religion in our daily lives? The second book, you know, by Sheikh al-Suduq, Man la yahdaruhu al-faqih, during the time of the third and the fourth deputies of Al-Imam al-Mehdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu al-Sharif. These books, this book, Man la yahdaruhu al-faqih, had many fiqhi hadith inside of them, jurisprudential hadith inside of them. And the ones that Sheikh al-Saduq himself was using to determine verdicts on laws, to provide rulings on laws. He was using them himself. Unfortunately, many of these hadith were mursal hadith, meaning the people who were narrating them, many of them were missing in the transcription of the hadith. The chain was incomplete in that sense. And Sheikh al-Saduq has written other books like Ilal al-Shara'i' and other collections as well. The third and the fourth book are the ones written by Sheikh al-Ta'ifa, Sheikh al-Tusi, who produced for us Tahzib al-Ahkam fi Sharh al-Muqniyah and al-Istibsar. And these occurred after the minor occultation had occurred. And these included not only basically doctrinal hadith, but also jurisprudential hadith on them as well. Now, the one thing about many of these collections, and included amongst these are Bihar al-Anwar, which comes much, much later on, or Wasa'il al-Shia, which is written by Al-Hurr al-Amili, which is very important for fiqhi matters. But there are many hadith that have come into these that have just been collected. And you see this tendency amongst the Shia just to take the hadith and collect them and do so without paying attention or really immediately giving sort of time to determine authenticity. Why? Because again, there was too much political oppression. There was not openness for Shia until the Safavid dynasty to really come out and openly act as a madhab, as a sect. And indeed, it's only recently that the Azhar University in Cairo announced that the Ja'fari Ithna Ashari sect of Islam is a proper sect of Islam. So you can imagine hundreds of years ago that the Shi'i felt oppressed, that they felt they couldn't come out openly and share the hadith that were in their collection. And out of fear of losing them, they felt that let's just make an encyclopedia, collect all the hadith together, and then later on we will develop a system by which we can determine authenticity. And hence, you see, Bihar al-Anwar is a great collection of lots and lots of hadith. Unfortunately, there is much in there that is not authenticated. And we believe that Allama Majlisi rahmatullahi alayh, he was intending to authenticate but never got to that point. So we know that there are these compendiums of hadith. So now as we get to that point, and we know that the determination of hadith as being an authentic source of religion, not just from a theological perspective, but from a jurisprudential perspective, occurred why? Well, as I mentioned to you, there were those companions in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, and after they started to die and leave this world, fewer and fewer people had met Rasulullah. Now, instead of Sahaba, you have what is called a Tabi'un. Tabi'un are the people who did not meet Rasulullah directly, did not see him, but they were trying to find a way to connect to him through the Sahaba. Now, the advantage of the Shia is that we have this unbreaking link that starts from Rasulullah, goes to Imam Ali, goes to Imam Hassan, goes to Imam Hussein, and you know the 9 children of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salatu wassalam are this unbroken chain from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam. And so our tabi'un come much later on. And now those tabi'un who now connect to the imamat have a means by which they can determine what is considered to be authentic or not. So in the modern sense, you see that the science of hadith that has developed takes this collection of hadith, some of which are authentic, some are not authentic, some are questionable, some have ta'arud in them, etc., etc., and you apply a science to it, all right? And you would do this science, why? Because the Quran says, tabayyanu, find out what is the truth, determine what is the truth. And so you do that in a number of ways. One, you do something called dirayatul hadith, or apply what is called the science of mustalahat. The science of mustalahat essentially, and just sort of keeping it brief, is looking at what is authentic and what is not authentic in terms of content and meaning. For example, if there were to be a hadith that said it is permissible for you to drink wine, then we know that that is not correct because the content is false. It goes against the Holy Quran. Quran talks about khamr and says that this is prohibited to you. So if a hadith were to come and say that go ahead and drink khamr on such and such a day, it's permissible, we know that that's not acceptable, that the content and the meaning are wrong. So this is sort of the mustalahat or dirayatul hadith. The other thing is something called fiqhul hadith. The fiqh of hadith is when you are trying to determine the significance of the words. When a word is used in a certain context in the hadith, what does that word mean? What is it suggesting? What is its general meaning? And if at all, is there a specific meaning to it? And again, these are some of the deeper points of the science of hadith. The other aspect to studying hadith is ilm al-rijal. Ilm al-rijal basically now is going to look at the other component of hadith, and that is the men who are transmitting the hadith. Can we determine who they are? Is their sanad proper? Meaning, is the chain of the men who are transmitting the hadith, where does it come from? Does it lead directly to the masoom? Or does it come from a tabi', a companion who came after the time of the imam? Is it from a companion, one of the ashab al-ijma'? And from them, who are the men in between who brought that hadith to you? And that's why you know that there are those that are mutawattir, those that have a good chain of transmitters, and that chain of transmitters is so good that its veracity cannot be doubted, its authenticity cannot be doubted. And even with respect to the mutawattir hadith,
there are usually two types of those hadith. One is called, it's lafzi, it's considered to be verbal, and the other is ma'nawi. So there is a mutawattir hadith that is lafzi, and there is one that is ma'nawi. The mutawattir hadith that is a lafzi, the one that is based on specific wordings, the wordings of which have been consistently transmitted and are the same across all relators, all narrators. An example of that, Hadith al-Ghadir, Man kuntu mawla fahadha aliyun mawla, or Hadith al-Thaqalain, in which Inni tarikun fikum al-Thaqalain, I'm leaving amongst you two, or Thaqalain, I'm leaving amongst you two weighty objects. This is a lafzi hadith, mutawattir hadith. The ma'nawi one is one in which it's the implication of the hadith that is uniformly accepted. So, for example, let's say take the bravery of Imam Ali alayhi salatu wassalam. There are many hadith using different types of language that assert the bravery of Ali ibn Abi Talib and sort of his valor on the battlefield. Or there are many different hadith that point that a Muslim must pray 5 times a day, or the obligations of how you behave with the opposite gender. The verbal content is not the same. The words used, the sentences used are not the same, but the context and the meaning is the same. So these are ma'nawi hadith. Other than that, other than the mutawattir hadith, there is the khabar al-wahid. Khabar al-wahid, that is the hadith that has come basically from one transmitter, one narrator, or maybe a handful of narrators. And that's why it can be mustafid or mashhur or something like that. The hadith that have accurate and strong and authentic chains of transmitters are often used and accepted to be authentic and are applied as such. Khabar al-wahid are not, because it rests on the fact that who is the transmitter? Who is this person who is giving the hadith? If it is somebody like Zurara, let's say, who great companion of our Imams, Zurara ibn A'yun was known. He was known very well and attested to by the Imam himself. Hence, when he said something, the weight of that statement that he is relaying from a Imam himself has different meaning than somebody who maybe does not have that form of authenticity. So you can see that when you come to the science of that hadith today, we know that all of those hadith that were collected then went through this rigorous process. And this happened much after the collection of these great books. Books like Al-Kafi, like Man La Yahdarahu Al-Faqih, like Istabsar, like the other books, even like Bihar Al-Anwar, and other books like Wasa'il al-Shia, which are very jurisprudentially based, in which now the fuqaha, the people studying the hadith, particularly for derivation of laws, are looking at the hadith and applying them. Brothers and sisters, you know that not every hadith that is sahih, that is correct, that is acceptable to the scholar is going to be acted on. On the other hand, there are some hadith that may have weak content. The content of it is weak, or it doesn't have the clearest meaning, but the chain of narrators may be correct. The chain of narrators may be authentic and trustworthy. Hence, the scholars are going to take that content that is questionable or a little ambiguous, and they are going to apply it accordingly. And knowing the science of how it came about and the context in which it was used, very cautiously apply its rule to daily life. And that's why you see these sorts of tendencies, and even today. That's why we see even in our fiqh, and I will end with this, that our maraja, when they derive the laws, a fatwa is given very clearly. Why? Because the evidence in front of the faqih is clear. He says, I rule that this is permissible and this is not permissible, or such and such is allowed, such and such is haram. However, in the case where the evidence may not be as clear, particularly with respect to contemporary issues, what do? And that's why oftentimes the maraja, people like Samahat al-Sayyid al-Sistani, may Allah preserve his life, will give a ruling with precaution. So they will say, based on obligatory precaution, you should or should not do such and such a thing. And then rely on the fact that the person can take the ruling, the fatwa of the next most knowledgeable marja, al-a'lam fal-a'lam, which is known as. And so Even today, that application is very carefully looking at the hadith. The dirayatul hadith, the fiqhul hadith is still being applied in that manner. But it's done with the understanding of all of these hundreds of years, these 1400 years in which this information was collected. And not only collected, but the circumstances under which it was collected and brought all together. أقول قولي هذا أستغفر الله لي ولكم. My dear brothers and sisters, please read a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Thank you very, very much, Sheikh. That was a very comprehensive overview, and I'm sure everyone who is not already familiar, and even a lot of us, we all learned quite a bit from this topic. Thank you very much for this discussion. We're gonna probably move to some questions now, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay. So the first question we have is here. One question is, do you think our system of writing hadith, meaning within the 400 usul, is superior to oral preservation of hadith?
I don't have an opinion on something like that. I can't speak authentically or sort of professionally enough to state that oral transmission is better from written transmission. I don't know enough of that. I do know, however, that the tradition of transmitting orally was already there pre-Islamically. So it was practiced with a great deal of rigor. Yet the collection of the writing, let's even just take the example of the Holy Quran, which we believe that when Rasulullah was about to pass, that he confirmed with Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam that the book form, the written form of the Quran had been assured, and that even in his time, he would go back to each of the writers of the Quran, those who were transcribing it on the skins, on the the palm fronds, or wherever they were writing, and checking to see that there were no errors. Hence the importance of writing it down in a time and in a society where oral tradition was so popular. So I don't know that I can say one was stronger than the other. I think both were obviously necessary given the circumstances.
Thank you very much. The next question is, we have a question saying, Salam Sheikh, you mentioned that the point of the Ahlul Bayt was to fix the disparities between the fallible companions after the demise of the Prophet by explaining and transmitting the proper sunnah. Doesn't this problem arise again once the ghaiba occurred? Fallible narrators narrating differing things amongst each other due to the absence of the Imam. Essentially what I'm trying to say is that isn't the state of the Shia by the time of the ghaiba exactly the same as the state of the Sahaba once the Prophet died?
Yeah, that's a great question. The only difference is that by the time you get to the later Imams, you already know the constraints upon you, right? At the time of Rasulullah's demise, I hate to say it in this way, but there was not really a true sectarianism, right? There was no real, although it was occurring, there was no systemic sort of oppression of followers of Ahl al-Bayt. Whereas in the time of the later Imams that existed, so maybe there was this heightened, and again, this is me speaking, maybe there was this heightened consciousness amongst the followers of Ahl al-Bayt that over all of these years, these whatever 260 years since the hijrah of Rasulullah, in which progressively the state of the Sahaba of the Imams has gotten worse and worse, that we consciously are going to ensure that fidelity is kept in writing them, at least amongst the ones who are the closest to the Imams of the time. And indeed, that's what you see, right? For the Shia, we know that our Imams had close companions. Imam Mehdi, in fact, even Imam Al-Hadi alayhi salam, his close companion was the first of the Nawab, the deputies, men who were trustworthy. So confidants who were going to ensure the protection of Hadith. I think in that sense, the later era is very different from the earlier era, because there was not this sense after the time of Rasulullah's demise that suddenly everything is going to get distorted. At least I don't think the average person or even the average follower of Ahl al-Bayt thought that way. But again, this is just my thinking. It's not something that a scholar has said or imam has said. Yes.
Thank you again. We have another question saying, how can a narrator be described as trustworthy or graded trustworthy? As in, what are they looking for when they're grading someone as trustworthy? And how do we know that for a specific hadith that the chain of transmission is true? That how do we know that this chain of transmission that has gotten to us is the correct one and it has not been altered in some way?
Yeah, great question. So, establishing trustworthiness of the person, of the narrator, if the imam himself had said that this person is trustworthy, like Zurara, or the companions of other companions of Al-Imam as-Sadiq, then we know that they were trustworthy because imam said it, and he established it. Number two, how do you tell that the chain of those narrators are authentic for a given hadith? Well, there are many ways. Again, you go back, and that's why there is this thing called ilm al-rijal. You go and you very carefully see this person. You trace back the lineage of that person. Where did they come from? Not necessarily family line, but certainly what their allegiances were. So if there was one amongst them who was an enemy of Ahl al-Bayt, then you would not take the hadith from that person. Or if you found someone in there who was a fasiq, for instance, or there was evidence that he was involved in fisq, then you would not take the hadith. Or let's say there was a rawi, a narrator who you didn't know anything about, they're unknown. This name comes in randomly, and there's no sort of background information about them, any sort of authentication of who they were or where they came from. Then again, it is a big giant hole. In that case, that hadith may not be thrown out in its entirety. It may be mursal, meaning the narrators are not complete. If you found that same hadith, despite the fact that this one narrator is unknown or not reliable, you found that same hadith in another place with authentic narrators, completely authentic, or in two other places where it is narrated by authentic narrator, then you know the hadith is correct, despite the fact that that one narrator may be in question. I hope that made sense.
It made plenty of sense, actually. Thank you very much. We have another question saying, how do we know what was said by the imams in taqiyya or versus what was not said in taqiyya?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a hard one. Usually the hadith reveal that. And not only do the hadith reveal that, if one hadith shows an action that is somewhat contrary from the sense of the content and the language being used, it can be indicated in certain ways, and that is revealed by another hadith, another tradition that says something completely opposite to what is being said in the first hadith. And again, the content, the language indicates that the second hadith is the one that should be acted on. That's how it is known. It is a bit complex, not so easy to explain in words, but usually it's by comparison. By looking at context, looking at the language, and then comparing it to what else is present in terms of the subject matter.
Thank you very much. And if I had to elaborate on that, do you mean that we should be looking for clues within what's being said, like sort of how they're saying it, what they're trying to say, in order to see if it's taqiyya or not?
Yes, so it, again, that all comes down to the science of hadith, right? And that's why the scholars who are sort of analyzing these traditions, they have a great deal of skill. They have a great deal of understanding, not only of sort of the Arabic language, but the context in which words were used, and certainly sort of the day-to-day lives of the people, because language that was used in a day-to-day sense may have had varying meanings.
Thank you very much. We have another question about, this time it's about Kitab Sulaim.
Yes.
The question is, how are we assured of the authenticity of Kitab Sulaim, given that its chain of transmission reaching us is disputed, and some of the scholars, such as Sheikh Mufid, have criticized it and said that its content is confusing?
It's correct. So I don't think it's up to us to authenticate or not authenticate, right? We don't have the knowledge to do that. Unless I am a marja, unless I am someone who has studied in the hawza for 30, 40, 50 years, and I have delved into the science of the hadith and sort of the history of Kitab Sulaim, there's no way for me as a layperson, and I am certainly that, to say whether it is authentic or not. It is to go back to see what do the scholars see, right? And that's why Mufid in Tasheeh al-I'tiqad, he mentions that it is not universally authentic. There are things that have entered into it that are not authentic, and that's why scholars check very carefully. Scholars check very carefully. And there is one hadith in there that unfortunately becomes a very, I don't know, a source of contention, particularly coming up in the next month or so, if you understand my meaning.
Yeah, I understand your meaning. Thank you very much about that. Let's see, what's another question here? Let's see. We have a question saying, how accurate is the Shia method of collecting hadiths versus methods that were used for example, Bukhari and other Sunni books of hadith?
Yes, so I'm comparatively, I cannot give you the answer as clearly from whatever little I know, because I have not really studied the Ahl Sunnah's approach to usage of hadith and application of hadith in their laws and in their way of life. I only know a little bit. I believe there are differences in authenticating narrators and what is to be done about hadith that are mursal, particularly those in which narrators in the middle or parts of the chain are unknown or questionable. I think this is where many of the differences lie. Not only that, the differences lie in who the narrators are, who is considered to be acceptable and not. For us, the relationship to Ahl al-Bayt of the narrator is a very important thing. Meaning, if there is anyone who aligned with the enemy of Ahl al-Bayt or was an enemy of Ahl al-Bayt themselves, then the hadith that they would narrate is questionable. Whereas for the Ahl Sunnah, that is not a concern. That is not something that is used as a metric for determining the correctness or the authenticity of the narrator. But I cannot provide more. I don't have the knowledge of the comparability, and I have not studied the Sunni approach very well.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I'm sure people understand. Thank you either way. We have one more question here. It's saying, we often hear that the Quran should be the only source of information and that it is complete. We can observe hadiths that explain some context, however we also observe some hadiths that add to the Quran, such as playing chess or listening to music. How can we make sure of the authenticity of the ruling of this topic when it doesn't go back to the Quran? Okay, can the person who asked this, for example, explain if they can? I can give you access to speaking on the mic. There, I unmuted you, if you're able to speak.
I think I can answer that if you want, Musa.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'll venture an answer based on what I think is being asked.
Okay.
So any derivation of what is correct or not correct, permissible or not permissible, is going to be done on the four components, as we all know. Quran, Sunnah, Aql, and Ijma'. These four things. The first two are primary. And if you even reduce it further, the first is primary, right? The only one that is unblemished is the Holy Quran. So anytime a hadith is being used to derive a law, to determine permissibility or action or philosophy or of belief, etc., all of that is going to begin with the Holy Quran. And if it comes down to the level of the hadith, it still has to be checked back on the Quran. That is a given. That if the hadith in any way, shape, or form, and the A'imma al-Athhar themselves have said this, that refer back what we do or what you have heard about us doing to the Holy Quran. And if it is not in line with the Quran, then it is not from us. Hence, today when we derive laws, when the Maraja, they derive laws, the Quran, even in the explanation of the theological or philosophical aspects of the Quran, you still have to go to hadith. And that's why you have Tafsir al-Burhan, which is probably one of the biggest collection of hadith that explain the verses of the Holy Quran. Why? Because even that hadith has to refer back to something, and that something is the Holy Quran. It is the source.
Thank you. Um, and let's see, we have another question here. Oh, I actually had a question. That is, who were the ghulat and how did they affect our hadith?
Yeah, the ghulat are extremists, for lack of a better term. People who took the meaning, and we see them today, unfortunately. People who say things that are inappropriate, people who distort our belief in the Ahl al-Bayt to a level that makes it into kufr, makes it into shirk. These were people who, particularly in the time of Imam al-Sadiq, Imam al-Kadhim, Imam al-Baqir, even before them, when basically people began to discuss God and religion and the philosophy of creation and Quran, there were many Shia who believed in the Ahl al-Bayt, in the Imams, but they took that belief to such a far extreme, claiming wal-ayadu billah, Godhead for them, or for Amir al-Mu'mineen, saying that they are uncreated, meaning they were ever present before time, etc. There were many ghulat were there, and they have existed in the Shia, and even today they exist in the Shia. You will see in the Shia world, there are ghulat. There are people who say things that go outside the realms of our beliefs and ascribe our Ahl al-Bayt, particularly, the Imams particularly, status that is beyond human. And that is rejected almost entirely and summarily by all of our scholars.
Thank you very much. And it seems as though the questions on directly pertaining to the topic are have mostly been finished, I think. So that being said, would you like to open up to any other, just a few, one or two miscellaneous questions?
Sure, no problem.
We have one question saying, Sheikh, do you recommend attending Hawza? And if one cannot attend, what books would you recommend reading for one to become at the same level of a student of the Hawza?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, if you want to attend Hawza, you should attend Hawza. The question I always ask is, why do you want to attend Hawza? Unfortunately, today, I see people who attend the Hawza not because they want to learn, not because they want to be better Muslims, but because they want to become speakers. And if your goal is to become a speaker, then just become a speaker. You don't need to go to Hawza. Hawza is a way of life. It is something you do to deepen your faith, to learn more. And after taking that first step of learning and deepening your faith, humbling yourself, teaching others, not speaking. And that's why if you want to go to Hawza to learn, by all means, you should. Take any opportunity to learn. But what I can tell you this, and I am an example of this, that you don't necessarily need to go to Hawza in the traditional manner to learn. Books are available. All the books that the people in the Hawza study, books on, like, let's say, Mantiq al-Muzaffar, or the Halaqat by Sayyid al-Shahid, all of these are available and are being even translated if you don't speak Arabic or Farsi today. And one can read and study and read and study and deepen knowledge. And I almost feel that that has a great deal of blessedness. Why? Because you did it of your own volition and didn't enter into a system of learning like the Hawza.
Thank you very much. And we have another question. He's saying, I guess he's asking, did any of the companions differ in belief from each other? And if so, how can we determine which ones were correct and which ones were not from the statements of the Imams?
I see. So companions of Imams, not Rasulullah?
Either one. Did any of the...
Of course. Of course they did. Of course they did. There were many companions who differed. So let's say, for example, in the time of Imam al-Baqir, Imam al-Sadiq, you had men like Zurara ibn A'yun, you had Ma'ruf ibn Kharbuz, you had Abu al-Basir al-Asadi, Abu Basir is well known, Fudayl ibn Yassar. But amongst them, there were also men like Jamil ibn al-Darraj, who probably was the most learned of them. And on top of that, we know like men like Hisham ibn al-Hakam, who became a Shi'i very young and became a great student of Imam when he was very young, had a very high status in comparison to the other students. So we know that the companions of the Imam certainly must have differed, just like Salman al-Farsi differed from Abu Dharr in his level of faith. And so other than the indications given to us by the Imams themselves, there's no way for us to know who had what position. Clearly, the ones who are indicated by the Imams, that if a visitor came to ask and had a set of questions, Imam would say, go and ask Hisham, go and ask such and such, go and ask such and such. We know that those men must have been so high in their position in the eyes of the Imams in terms of their faith and their knowledge. Hence, Imam would defer to them, even with him being present in the company of all of these people. So that may be an indication, but other than that, there's no other way.
Thank you very much. And with that, I think that pretty much wraps up all of our questions that have been asked. I see someone else is typing something, so I'll just wait for them really quickly, and then we
Sure.
can wrap up, inshallah.
Sure, no problem.
Thank you very much again, by the way. This has been
My honor.
very informative and I hope very helpful for everyone here,
Forgive us for any shortcomings.
inshallah. He's asking, how do we know the chains that have a group of our people, meaning udda min al-ashabina, how do we know it is not mursal?
Again, ilm al-rijal will go in, and if that group of narrators, uddatan min rijalina, or a group of our men is expounded upon and identified member by member, and each of those members is then clarified, then you know. If they cannot be identified, then it remains mursal, right? Then it remains with this question mark on it. Other than that, there's no way. Later on, it is what happened after Kulayni's time, after the time of his mu'asirin, who people came and tried to identify who are these redacted names, which are the redacted names, and who are those people. Yes, I don't know if that answered the question.
I think it did. Thank you very much. Once again, we really appreciate having you here.
My honor. Thank you for having me.
I hope everyone was able to benefit from this, inshallah. And with that, I think we can wrap this up. Once again, thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Keep us in your prayers, please, and let us know if you have any more questions.
Yep. If you have any questions, you can always DM me, or
Musa,
the Sheikh is.
do you wanna unmute people?
Oh, right. Yeah, that's a good idea. We should unmute some people before they leave, because they're gonna stay server muted. But with that, I think that wraps up the event. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa
Thank you,
alaikum
sir.
salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, let me stop the recording.